On today's episode of the Going Commando podcast, we're going to recap the entirety of the 2024 NFL Draft, talking about each of the selections that new GM Adam Peters made in his first draft at the helm of our front office. We're going to give our own personal draft grades, how we think things went, and finish up with some undrafted free agent talk. So without further ado, let's get the show started. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode of the Going Commando podcast. I'm joined, of course, by my co-hosts Chris and Tom, and it's been about a month since the NFL draft concluded. We have a chance to look at the entirety of this new draft class and all of the undrafted free agents that were brought in as well. Um, Certainly a lot to go over, some big changes, some picks that could be really defining for this team in the years to come.
Absolutely, and this was a draft that I think a few of us have been looking forward to in this podcast. I may probably all of us, honestly. There was a little bit of talk about, are we going to move around? Are we going to take the guy that's expected? And we did take the guy that was expected. Obviously, I had my thoughts on it. As we stand now, I'm very happy with the draft we had, and I'm excited to talk about these guys.
Agreed. I think it was a good overall draft. I think it's just crazy to me to look at this roster and how it looks right now compared to what it looked like at the end of the season last year. I was listening to 106.7 The Fan a few weeks back, and I mean this statistic is definitely even out of date by now, but they had recorded down that Washington had brought in 43 new players via the draft and free agency so far this offseason. And that number is even higher now from when I heard that statistic. Several players, in addition to that, have been brought in since. So just really cool and interesting to see how they're shaping this roster. And yeah, really excited to be talking about the draft. I think there were a lot of good things that were happening, and we'll just have to kind of see how it goes. But yeah, overall, excited to get into it.
Yeah, you're certainly right about that. This roster is going to look a heck of a lot different. I mean, you've got starters, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, you're going to see a lot of new starters this year. And of course, a lot of big names entering in on offense. And I think it's only right that we start off with kind of the showstopper, if you will, the biggest pick, the biggest addition in draft or free agency, which was of course quarterback Jaden Daniels with the second overall pick. It's something that we thought was going to be happening for a while. When we signed Mariota, I kind of had the feeling that, okay, this is a guy that has a similar kind of skill set to a Jaden Daniels. It would make a lot of sense if that's what they were preparing to do. Probably knew that we weren't going to be able to draft Caleb Williams as he was seemingly locked in to go to Chicago. But Jaden Daniels was the pick. And it seems that they also tried to address a few things throughout this draft to help him uh, as he enters the NFL, and kind of looking at some of the free agency signings we made as well, that lends to helping a young quarterback. But Jaden Daniels, a Heisman winner, an eerily similar kind of situation to what we've seen back in 2012. Of course, we took our Robert Griffin III with that pick, a Heisman quarterback. We do so again here, albeit adding another quarterback later on. Last time, of course, via draft. This time, undrafted free agent. We will get into that more as we go on, but it feels good to finally seemingly have a guy that this franchise front office coaching staff is 100% locked in on. Last year there were still questions about whether or not Sam Howell was really the guy. He had to kind of prove it. Obviously, Jaden Daniels will still need to prove it, but this is the first time in quite some time that I feel that our organization is putting their full confidence in a quarterback.
Absolutely. And let me say, obviously, I haven't been the biggest fan of this draft pick in the past. I've advocated, obviously, for different players to be taken at the number 2 spot. I felt that there was other needs which could be adequately addressed at this spot. We're a few weeks removed from the draft at this point, and you know, you make an interesting point with Marcus Mariota. Obviously, Jaden Daniels has a very similar skill set. Both former Pac-12 quarterbacks, both Heisman winners. So I think that's a great guy to have behind Jaden Daniels. And you know, sort of as we see the way that people are talking about this guy post draft, it becomes very interesting because, as I mentioned to Clark pre-show, you have guys like Herm Edwards saying that this guy might be the second coming of Randall Cunningham. Obviously, a very successful dual threat quarterback in the NFL. You have guys who are also in the media landscape who are saying that this guy was the best quarterback in the draft. You see some stuff coming out on Commander's social media and other social media about how he's been looking in practice, and his release, as I've mentioned to Clark pre-show, has looked amazing. It's very quick. It even seems faster than the guy they thought we might take in Drake May. And Jaden Daniels really seems to have brought a new life to this team. He seems to come along with this organization as they go through this process of sort of building a contender, not necessarily from scratch, but certainly using a lot of different ingredients than we've seen in the past. Um, and you make a great point. I mean, we'll get to it later, but they did everything they could in this draft to kind of give him tools to at least work around. They also did that in free agency. They have a lot of tools to begin with some of this roster, which I think is really interesting to talk about. So overall, I think, you know, a few weeks removed, much like last year, I feel better about the pick. But certainly there was a little bit of discomfort there for me early on.
Yeah, I think Adam Peters and company did, as much as they didn't want to be doing this, they really did kind of telegraph this pick here, especially to your point, Clark, with the Marcus Mariota veteran signing. Another second overall QB taken, as a matter of fact. But I think that Jaden Daniels was clearly the most ready to play QB out of the QBs from the draft, and I think that played a factor as well. I mean, he has the most games played out of the quarterbacks that were taken in the toughest college conference, obviously being the SEC, perhaps the most balanced QB in terms of running capability versus passer capability. And that's of course my opinion. And then he was also the first FBS player to have both career 12,000 plus passing yards and 3,000 plus rushing yards. So, I think there's a lot, and in addition to being the Heisman, of course. So I think there's a lot of good things and a lot of reasons why the organization felt comfortable taking him at the number 2 overall pick. Again, I'm really excited, and he has my full support. And again, to your point, again, I feel like this organization has never, or it's been some time since they've really put all their eggs in one, QB basket, so to speak. So again, really looking forward to seeing how the rest of this offseason goes and into preseason and the season, of course. But really comfortable with that pick, thought it was the right one to make, and was not surprised when heard his name being called.
Now, we haven't necessarily, of course, there's a lot of offseason still to come. I don't think he's necessarily been given the starting job yet, but all signs point to that being the case. And yeah, I do like, taking a look at this full roster and depth chart. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to be happy about the situation he's been put into. Everybody pre-draft was saying, "Oh, look at the job Chicago has done preparing Caleb Williams to step in." They got traded for Keenan Allen. They brought in DJ Moore the year before, draft Roma Dunze. They got a good tight end, Cole Kmet. You take a look at what the Commanders have done. First, you bring in Austin Eckler, who has been one of the best pass catching backs in the NFL for a long time now. And when you're a rookie quarterback, it's going to be nice to have that kind of security blanket. That other option comes in. You bring in a Zach Ertz, another guy that could be, you know, readily open on kind of shorter targets. And then, of course, having a Terry McLaurin, is never too shabby either. Um, the offensive line, sure, we'll get into that a little bit as there is, speculation that one of our new rookies could be starting on this offensive line this year. But I'm feeling good about where this team is at. Um, who's to say, how things will progress? But yes, with Jaden Daniels, it is comforting to me that we seemingly finally are investing in a quarterback and it's not kind of a whirlwind. I mean, since Kirk Cousins left, we have had a new starting quarterback at the beginning of every single season. And RG3, that seemed to be the hope way back when, but clearly we only got 1 year out of him. This organization wants to make sure that we're going to get a full return on investment for this number 2 overall pick. And I think that they've done a good job to put him in a position to hopefully succeed, or at least to acclimate himself well in his first season.
Absolutely, and I think that you got to talk about the organization when it comes to this draft too, and it does come with Jaden Daniels, but it comes with the rest of the draft as well. The organization did an amazing job at finding the talent that they believed in. They didn't seem to buy into any sort of hype or any of the changing narratives that happen in the NFL, especially around the draft. They seem to have locked down their guy. They made their choice. They seem very comfortable and happy with it. And as fans, that's all you can ask for is at least a sense of direction, if nothing else, which I think this team has lacked in the past. And not to say that Jaden Daniels alone gives us that direction, but the draft as a whole, including Jaden Daniels, gives us a direction to move forward into.
So let's keep this train rolling. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the next guy we picked in order? That would be our second round pick in Jer'Zhan Johnny Newton, who many thought was going to be a first round pick. I know that there were some issues with an injury. I know once he came in, I believe it was a foot problem. He had surgery. He is expected to be ready by the beginning of the season, but a defensive lineman out of Illinois. I've seen a lot of really good things about this guy. Possibly, not the biggest defensive tackle we've ever seen, but it's seemingly that's kind of been a trend in the NFL. You get these athletes to come and play on the defensive line, and there's many examples of those kind of players having high success. And you're bringing this guy into a defensive line room that already has Allen and Payne, 2 Pro Bowl level guys. You also sign several pieces to put on the edge, notably Dorrance Armstrong, from the Cowboys and Dan Quinn's days in Dallas. So Jer'Zhan Newton, some definitely a surprise that he went to 36. And I think this was an example of we're going to just draft the best player available on our board, even if, let's say, the defensive line wasn't necessarily our most striking need at the time.
Yeah, this one it did surprise me initially when I saw we're taking a defensive tackle with our second pick. But I get it. I mean, I think there was a lot of first round talent speculation here with Johnny Newton. However, the thing about the ankle, so as I understand, he had surgery on one of his feet that prior to the draft, that he had said, he's rehab, he's recovered, he's ready to go. We took him with that pick, and then shortly thereafter, he had another operation done of similar nature on the other foot. That is what he's currently recovering from now. I don't believe our staff was fully aware that Johnny was going to have that additional procedure on the opposite foot after taking him. Now, if they did, do I know if that would have impacted their decision to still take him there or not? I'm not sure. But it did seem like that was a surprise, especially when, Dan Quinn and Peters were kind of pressed on that in subsequent press conferences over the last couple weeks. It seems like they maybe were not aware of that, and even I think admitted to not being aware that he would need this secondary procedure after being taken in the draft. So that does concern me a little bit. It does still sound like he will or should be ready come week 1. However, he's not able to participate at the same level in a lot of these off-season activities, training camp activities, for a rookie that are so critical to their development in that first season. I think is what, not only just on the field, but gaining that camaraderie and sense of team really with the other guys in the room. So I'm a little concerned with this pick. I mean, in my research of him as a player prior to these, injuries and surgeries, I like what I see, and I understand why a lot of folks had him in that first round kind of talent category. But again, really just hoping that he can get healthy for us and be an impact player for us in rotation along with those guys we have up front, Duran Payne, Jonathan Allen. Would love to see, a huge contributing role out of him, especially given kind of the uncertainty of what we think is going to happen with the current depth we have at that position. So I like the pick. There's a little concerns there for sure.
Yeah, and Chris, you're right to have that concern, and I certainly agree with you. But I think that this is really sort of a home run pick for us. I mean, this is a guy who obviously had that first round designation, as you mentioned. He has the injury history, but we're not lacking at depth at this position. I mean, you have four defensive tackles from last year returning in Duran Payne, Jonathan Allen, Fidarian Mathis, and John Ridgway the third. You have a lot of depth there, so I think that the injury history can be overlooked a little bit, especially considering this guy is still very young. Foot surgery is a very difficult thing for these defensive linemen and these big guys. And that's not to say that this might not be a lingering issue for a while, and that this might not, be a bigger issue down the line, especially. But I mean, we've taken guys with injury issues, maybe even worn down bodies. I mean, you remember Jonathan Allen slid to us in that draft because of his arthritic shoulders. Um, so I'm not necessarily as worried about this pick as people think. I think that the depth that we have and the ability to sort of plug and play him and sort of keep those reps, not, he's not going to be a 40 down player, meaning he's not going to be in there for 40 plays of the game. He's going to come in for 15 to 10 for the first year. Maybe if he plays better, he gets a few more looks, but not too many. Obviously, as Clark mentions, we do have Pro Bowl level talent at this position, and he's going to be expected to contribute a little bit. And if he does, then boy oh boy, are we going to be happy that we got Jer'Zhan Newton in the top of the second round. Obviously, this was a weird draft defensively. You don't see a defensive guy taken until I think around the 15th or 14th pick. Never happened in draft history, at least modern draft history. So this is definitely a good add for our team. It's a first round level player who dropped because of injuries, but he's in a position that we don't necessarily have a gigantic need at, and that we don't necessarily expect him to play immediately at. So I think that this is a good pick. Obviously, the fear factor has to be there with the injuries, but this really does make sense. We took the best overall player on the board, or at least the best overall player that we had on our board, and we didn't look back. I mean, it's another great pick.
I
I
would
would
agree with that in terms of best overall player. And sometimes that's what you got to do when you're rebuilding a team like this. When Adam Peters is given the keys to retool this franchise, I think that is important, especially in a first draft under his direction. You want that guy to put your team in the best position by drafting the guys that he thinks would do the best. The one thing I would say is that, of course, a couple of years ago we did draft Fidarian Mathis in the second round. Um, and he ultimately hasn't really done much for us. Obviously got injured that first year. Last year, we were seeing John Ridgway, kind of getting a lot of the snaps over him. So what Chris mentioned about the injury is a bit concerning to me, but I think looking at the two, Jer'Zhan Newton certainly was the better prospect, and I would hope to kind of quell some of those concerns that I might have.
Yeah, I would argue that we took Johnny Newton here because the staff is concerned about the depth that we have at the position. Obviously, you have, as you mentioned, Tom, all pro, Pro Bowl caliber talent, in Allen and Payne up front. But after that, do we really have someone that we feel comfortable with taking on a major role if, hopefully wouldn't happen, but if one of those starting two were to go down, I would argue we've seen little to nothing out of Mathis in his career thus far. And Ridgeway, has shown flashes of being a good player, but has also proven to be fairly inconsistent as well. So I think that this is a sneaky position of need for us. If you think about it, you got to give those guys a breather if you want them performing at the high level. I think that's another problem. We just, a lot of times we're unable to get guys like Payne and Allen off the field. And then because they're on the field, some of their quality of play drops down because they're tired, they're gassed. So I get the pick. Um, if you're drafting someone at 36, you're expecting them to have a role and be at least a medium level contributor, I would say, going into the season. So um, overall, I like it the more I think about why Peters and company did what they did. I still concerned about the injuries, but overall, okay.
Well, next up on our draft board was a more clear-cut position of need, that being defensive back, corner, nickel corner, what have you. Pretty much all of the above, I would say, for that cornerback room. But we did end up taking with the 50th overall selection, Mike Sanderstill, uh, defensive back from Michigan. This is a guy that was the captain of this Michigan defense that won the national championship. He is a bit undersized, a 5'9" kind of slot corner, but was a playmaker for that team, his entirety of his career, former receiver turned defensive back, so clearly some good athleticism there. And, everything you hear John Harbaugh say, glowing, glowing, glowing reviews about this guy, not only as a player, but also as a leader. So I was pretty excited to see this. Of course, bit undersized, but that doesn't really, in my eyes, concern me that much that he may not be the tallest guy. You've seen shorter defensive backs have great careers, that kind of similar stature to Sanders still. And, you know, this is a coach that we have in Dan Quinn, a defensive mind. And, in Dallas, one of the things about those defensive backs is they were very aggressive, which one thing to talk about at another time, I think lends well actually to potentially maybe Emmanuel Forbes having a little bit of hopefully can have a little bit of a career resurgence in this new defensive scheme. But Mike Sanderstill, um, what do you guys think about this guy? I did not mind this pick, and I think that this is a guy that could come in and start at that kind of slot corner position right away.
Yeah, Mike Sainer still is a guy who character is the biggest thing for some of these teams, and he has it in gobs. He's a guy who obviously, as you mentioned, was the captain of that Michigan team. That's not an easy thing to do, especially at the college level. You really have to have the respect of your teammates, and when you're a 5'9" defensive back who's moved from receiver to corner during their college years, the old joke being that what's a receiver who can't catch a football, a cornerback. Um, he's one of these guys who really sort of made his own sort of lane. He was a big time playmaker from Michigan. He outplayed his size in some ways, which is definitely more of a viable option in the college ranks rather than the NFL ranks. So the size is definitely a big issue. I think that's why you see him slide down into this, sort of mid to late second round pick. Um, but for all intents and purposes, we got a guy who is a leader, who knows how to play the game, who knows what it takes to be a guy that leads his team to a championship in college, and we have a guy who is able to outplay his size. So those four things alone are very important towards him becoming an NFL player. I'm very happy with the pick. The undersized thing is definitely a worry, especially when you're in a division where you'll be playing a guy like AJ Brown twice, who just, he's built like a linebacker playing wide receiver out there. You have a guy like Malik Neighbors, who's a big physical receiver out of LSU, who's going to be an impact player for those Giants, at least for as long as he stays on that team. And you have a guy like CeeDee Lamb on the Cowboys, who's really, he's proving himself to be a number one receiver in this league. So the cornerback position is a position which we desperately need to improve on. I feel like he is probably an improvement, especially on the group that we have now. They kind of see him as the backup, the nickel, maybe the fourth corner on the field, depending on what the scheme looks like. That there's probably going to be a little bit of different looks thrown out there. There might be some things that we didn't see in Dallas that we might now see at the Commanders, especially now that Dan Quinn does have the pressure of being a head coach again and will have to perform at an above average level, sadly, which we haven't had for a coach in a little while. So I think Sainer still is a great player to add here. I think that he's a great character. I think that if anything, the undersized thing is a big worry, especially given our division and the talent within it. But in terms of a guy that you bring in to, sort of change maybe the locker room a little bit, or maybe try and just, show the other guys what you are looking for in a guy. Mike Sainer still is absolutely a guy with great character. So.
Yeah, I like it. Definitely a position of need for us, especially with one or two departures that we had, and just kind of a lot of uncertainty at that group. I think you'll see a lot of Mike on the field. So really excited, and to your point about him being a team captain, that's another trend that we really see Adam Peters and Dan Quinn honing in on. They're really looking for guys that were not only talented at their positions, but leaders amongst their team. They're looking for a certain type of player and a certain type of character to bring in and really define what it means to be a commander. So this pick falls right in line with that. So again, very very excited for him.
One last thing that I do want to throw in as a note here is that it's interesting because Nick Saban actually sort of gave his opinion on Mike Sainristil, and he said that Mike Sainristil may be pound for pound the best football player in this draft, which is a glowing endorsement from a guy who has coached up some of our All Pros and many Hall of Famers. So it's just going to be interesting to see where a guy like that sort of lands on the depth chart and how, that sort of translates into the NFL, especially given that glowing review.
That'll take us to our next pick. It is our third second rounder, which was pretty awesome. When we're in a situation where we are rebuilding, to have the amount of day two picks, the amount of picks we had in the first 2 days, pretty solid in my opinion. And we ended up taking a position that has been of much discussion on this podcast, the tight end room, a tight end room that all of us have said is possibly one of the worst tight end rooms over the past several years. We end up taking Ben Sinnott, tight end from Kansas State. This is a guy that also played some fullback, a proven blocker, and a pass catcher, caught 49 receptions for 676 yards and 6 touchdowns last season. I was really excited about this pick. The more that I saw, it just seems like you're kind of prototypical tight end, a guy that can do it all. And if he can live up to that kind of billing, I think that this pick has the ability to be great. Also, one other thing to note before we pass it off, uh, Ben Sinnott, when he was called by Adam Peters to be drafted, he said, "You reminded me a lot of a couple guys I drafted slash brought in when I was in San Francisco. Two guys by the name of Kittle and Juszczyk." So definitely, I think a lot we can say about this pick.
I mean, let's be honest. The first words that came to my mind when I saw this pick were hallelujah. We finally got a tight end who can do more than just receive and can do more than just block. That's not a shot at Cole Turner. That's not a shot at John Bates. That's more of a point to the fact that we drafted a guy who can do a little bit of everything on the field. We need a tight end that we can take into this future of the NFL where the tight end position is so valuable, especially to quarterback development. Now, Ben Sinnott is a guy who comes out of Kansas State, and you're probably thinking, hey, that's not a great place to come out of. Who's heard of Kansas State? Well, let me tell you what, this guy was probably the best player on the field for them, and that is saying quite a bit when you consider, sort of the talent that these college football programs are able to bring in now with the transfer portal and guys looking for playing time over necessarily prestige. Um, Now, is he going to be a day one starter? Absolutely not. I think that he's a guy that you see work in, especially as a number two, maybe even a number three. They have him slotted in ESPN as the number 2 tight end in the depth chart. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that you might see John Bates get a little bit more of a look, as he is probably the best blocker on our team, especially given that he has the NFL experience that Ben Sinnott sort of lacks at this point. But that is not to say that I am not very happy about this pick. We got a guy who, as you said, Clark, was compared to Juszczyk, compared to Kittle, two guys who, in all likelihood, at the end of their career, will end up at least getting Hall of Fame votes, if not the full gold jacket. So Ben Sinnott is definitely a guy who I think that we are going to have our eyes on for the next 2 to 3 years, because he could be the guy that takes over here once a guy like Zach Ertz leaves. Now, the other interesting thing here involving Zach Ertz is that they're two guys who play very similarly. I mean, Zach Ertz kind of was a do-it-all guy when he was with the Eagles, obviously. Then he goes to the Cardinals later on in his career, kind of has a bit of a resurgence. Really, a guy who's been trusted by quarterbacks through Super Bowls and through regular seasons to teach Ben Sinnott the ropes of being an NFL player. And that's not to say that he's trying to groom him to take over the position or whatever, or trying to get him into get him into this offense a little bit quicker than he needs to. But Ben Sinnott is a guy who is probably going to come in, and in the next 2 years, whether or not we like it and whether or not uh, he performs necessarily in this first year, he's going to come in 2 to 3 years and take over that starting position, and we will probably be better for it. And I think one of the interesting things that you also do bring up, Clark, is the fact that he did play fullback in college. He has that blocking experience. So we can even throw him out there for some of the run game that we want to have, if we don't necessarily believe in having a fullback as a designated roster spot, which a lot of teams nowadays don't do. Um, so yeah, he's a guy that's going to be worked in, whether it's a lot or a little. I think it's going to be positive for us no matter what. There was a little bit of issue with his hands, which is why you see him move to that fullback position. But in the NFL, with the coaching that he's going to get, and with sort of the expectations that we are levying on him, which I'm sad to say are probably a bit higher than we should levy on him at this point. Um, this is going to be a guy that's going to be an impact player. And I do want to make one last point before I hand it over to my co-host here, that, Clark, you bring up the fact that we have a number of picks in the first 2 days of the draft. We have obviously the number 2 overall pick, and then we have, I believe, 3 in the second round and 2 in the third. We make a trade with the Eagles, which almost looks questionably bad for the Eagles, but they kind of end up getting the guys that they want at their pick. So I'm not necessarily ready to say that we beat the Eagles on that trade, but you make a great point about how when you have these picks in the first 2 days of the draft, you are able to make a markable impact on your team by bringing in talent that is not only going to transcend what you have, maybe in 2 to 3 years, but maybe it's a guy that comes in his first year and makes a big splash, like maybe Ben Sinnott will, and will change the trajectory of your franchise. So I'm very happy with how this ended up. We did end up getting the tight end. I think that we improved our tight end room undoubtedly. Now, can I say that this is a better room than we entered the draft with? Not necessarily. I think there's still a lot of unknown talent and unknown quantities in this room that we need to figure out what they actually do for our NFL offense. But undoubtedly, we got a great player with Sanat. I think that he's going to work out very well with the new head coaching staff, with Jaden Daniels, with all the newness around. There's not going to be necessarily as much pressure to perform in his first year as there may be down the line. And I think that'll also be positive for him. So that's my 2 cents on this. Very happy. Obviously, we've pestered on this for a bit. And I'm happy to throw it to one of you guys now for an opinion. I'm sorry for sort of hijacking the mic there.
I knew that you would have a lot to say about the tight end room and this pick, because obviously it's been a topic of contention for quite some time on this podcast. In some ways, a lot of the things that you said I agree with. I happen to think that this is a guy that is going to be playing a decent amount. I mean, you could see this guy on the field with Zach Ertz as well. Lining up in the backfield potentially, being a pass catcher out of the backfield. Blocking plays. You name it. I really do think that this is a guy with some versatility that you don't have with Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz, not especially a great blocker. Uh, eh, I would see. I think Cole Turner is certainly in jeopardy. I mean, Cole Turner just does not have the same skill set that a Synod is going to have coming in. And John Bates, again, his blocking, it is valuable. I would picture him being the third guy. Um, again, who's to say? We're going to see how they progress in camp, but this was definitely a pick that I was very excited about. And, I think that there is certainly a lot of potential with this guy.
Yeah, as for Ben Sinnott, I thought this was a little bit high of a place in the draft to be taking him, considering we had other needs, specifically tackle, that was still present at the time. However, I do like it. He was the second tight end taken in the draft after Brock Bowers, and highly graded on a number of boards. So I've heard. Um, from what I've seen, he's good. He can block. He can catch. He'll be kind of under Zach Ertz, his mentorship, with him and the rest of the group. Another guy that can also block and catch, has been known to kind of be a good, well-rounded tight end in his career. So I think he's coming into a good spot again. Kind of concerned a little bit at the time. I was concerned, hey, we still haven't taken a tackle. What's going on? But I like the kid. He's got experience playing H back as well, and almost view him as kind of that potential Kyle Juszczyk type prototype player, right? So a guy that can maybe be a little bit in the backfield, play a little fullback for us as well. That versatility, I think, is going to serve him well in the NFL.
That would take us now to the third round. A second round is over. We had 3 picks in that second round, 2 in this third round. So that makes 5 picks on day 2, which is just awesome. I can't say enough how excited I am. We had one kind of towards the beginning of the second round and another or rather the third round, one towards the end. The first player we picked was the offensive lineman Brandon Coleman out of TCU. This guy was a starter on that team that made it to the national championship games 2 years ago. And this is a guy that has potential to see the field. At left tackle, you have Corn Lucas, still getting re-signed. I'm not sure where they'll slot him on the ESPN draft, or rather on the ESPN depth chart. They have Brandon Coleman slotted as actually the starting left tackle. I'm not so sure that is going to be how things will shake out. But nonetheless, it's a big body that we brought in to hopefully try to prove something in a room where there's a lot of guys that really have a lot of opportunity to impress in camp and over the summer to hopefully, try to stake their claim for a starting spot on this offensive line.
Brandon Coleman, obviously a guy, you want to talk about character again. This is a guy who comes out of Trinity Valley Community College. And you say, where the hell is that? And honestly, it doesn't matter because he stayed there for 1 year. He jumps over to TCU. He plays right tackle a little bit, and then he moves over to left tackle, where for the next 3 seasons, he allows only 1 sack over 723 snaps on the field. That is a great thing to see. Obviously, it's not the most competitive sort of football played in the Big 12. However, that ability to be versatile and move from tackle to tackle, he might be even able to play guard in the NFL. He's a little bit undersized, 6'4", 313. I know you're saying that's a big guy, but in the NFL, generally, that's around the size of a guard, maybe even a center, depending on what kind of scheme you're running. Maybe if you're running a bit more pass pro, then he's going to cut inside and be a big body. If you're running more running game, he might be on the outside. But point being here is that he is another character guy, another team captain, a guy who they kind of expected to move maybe to guard to be able to cement himself as an actual starter in the NFL. It'll be interesting to see if we do play him at tackle, because I do think he has potential to make it to the NFL as a tackle and sort of cement himself as a guy on this line. So certainly not mad with the pick, certainly very happy with it. There are question marks. There are a few things that I do want to see from him. Mainly, can he, be as mobile as he was in college? Can he sort of find a spot where he cements himself, whether that is at the tackle or the guard positions, or can we expect to see this guy playing in the next 2 to 3 years as a starter consistently? And I think that's really one of the big things here that we don't talk about with these picks is that these guys need to be able to be consistent players and need to be able to contribute to the team, especially considering the amount of draft capital which the ownership is sort of putting into these guys in their first year. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with him. I'm certainly not mad at the pick. I certainly think that there's a lot to this guy um, that is not necessarily, as touched on, but I think that there's a place for him in the NFL and a place for him on this team if he can make that transition as smoothly as some expect him to.
And regarding Brandon Coleman, yeah, I this was the long awaited pick for a tackle that I think we all were waiting for, really. And I think some of the reasons being that it kind of took us so long to get here is I think as the draft went on, we kept finding ourselves in a position where, hey, the the quality of tackle talent relative to the pick that we had at the time just was not aligning. So I think it really took till really the third round for us to kind of get value for the pick that we're having, or at least that's what I've heard some talking heads as well. Regarding the Washington, regarding this Washington team say. So he's played a good amount of both guard and tackle in his college career. Apparently plays fairly physical. Obviously, like I said, this is a pick that was needed. However, still a little bit of a head scratcher that this was the only offensive tackle taken in the draft. I mean, we have a lot of questions still along that offensive line, and we don't have to get too into it now, but I think that is still, in terms of a positional group, one of, if not the most questionable group in terms of we don't know where the pieces are going to lie week one, maybe of any group that we have on the team. But overall, we needed a tackle. We went in and got one. There, hopefully he can come in and be a starter week one for us. If not, I am a little concerned about this position. But we needed a tackle, and we went out and got one.
Yeah, finally, good to see that they did address this. You know, we weren't overly aggressive on the tackle front in free agency. There were some other guys picked up, like a Nick Allegretti, Michael Dieter, a kind of the interior line, but good to at least see a new face at the left tackle position. Did re-sign Corn Lucas, as I mentioned earlier, but um, hopefully this guy can turn into something for us. Will he be a day one starter? That is to be seen. Our next selection, final third round pick, at pick number 100. This is a guy that is getting a lot of attention from the NFL's social media and other outlets. Uh, you know, Primarily because of this guy's name, I would say. However, with a third round pick, he's got to be a solid player. It is Luke McCaffrey, the wide receiver from Rice. Of course, the younger brother of Christian McCaffrey, the all pro running back for the 49ers. Of course, there being a connection there as Adam Peters was a part of the front office that brought Christian to the 49ers in a trade from Carolina. So there could already be some familiarity with him and Peters and maybe some of the front office. They pick him to address a depth piece for wide receiver with pick 100. He seems like a great athlete. He put up great measurables at the combine. Um, he could be a slot option opposite of McLaurin and Dotson, maybe playing more outside roles this time around. So time will tell to see if this guy is going to truly be that third receiver for us. There's a lot of competition that he's going to have in that room. Um, but many people are thinking that he could be a guy slotted in to be a starting, that third starting receiver right away. What do you guys think about Luke McCaffrey?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about Luke McCaffrey. His father, Ed McCaffrey, obviously playing with the John Elway Broncos. He was a very important wide receiver. He doesn't necessarily have the size of his father nor the explosiveness of his brother, but he's a really smooth athlete. The interesting thing about him is that he actually started out his career as quarterback, and he was a top 11 quarterback in terms of recruiting for college. Even competed on the Elite 11, which is sort of an elite competition for these high school QBs. He moved to Rice, obviously, a little bit after starting in Nebraska and not having the best time. He switched over to the wide receiver position in his last 2 years in college because of JT Daniels transferring from USC to go to Rice. So he certainly doesn't lack for character. He has seemed to improve as he's been at the position, and he has a lot of guys in his corner, especially with regards to his family, who are going to be able to teach him a little bit more about this game. I agree with you, Clark. I don't think he's the third receiver on this team. I think you see guys like De'Ami Brown and Jameson Crowder really fighting for that third spot. Um, but this wasn't a wasted pick at all. I think that this is a guy who at the very least will come in and compete for a job, and maybe, you might see him, I'm sad to say, you might be seeing him take over some of the jobs that Dax Milne had last year, and that hurts me to say.
Yeah, there's a new Dax Milne in town here, Tom. No, I mean, I like this pick. I think it goes a lot more, obviously, than just the weight that his last name carries with him. I think, again, this was a guy that they saw as a leader. Obviously, Adam Peters having familiarity with him for quite some time and his family. This is a guy that is very vocal on and off the field. And I have watched a couple of his press conferences, and this is a guy, he's very energetic, very high energy, loves to speak and interact and engage with his teammates, reporters, fans, that sort of thing. And he just really fits the mold, I think, of the type of guys that they were looking to bring in here. I would not be surprised at all if Luke becomes a favorite target here for Jaden Daniels. I think the two have already begun to build a camaraderie and just kind of the rookie mini camp and what I've been able to see so far. So would totally expect him to be a contributor on offense, whether that's in that third or fourth kind of receiver role, even fifth potentially if you get, really good um, looks out of Diami and Crowder and maybe some others. But he's making this team, no question about it. And I think will be a guy that we can rely on hopefully this season, but also in seasons to come as another kind of leader in that wide receiver room, obviously behind Terry McLaurin. All that said, skipping over the fourth round, since we didn't have any fourth round selections, the next pick that we took, and I really think all these later picks, just to hammer it home, really exemplify the traits that we feel like they're looking for being team captains, leaders on their team, physical, right? It takes us to the fifth round, pick 139. We take Jordan McGee out of Temple, a downhill physical linebacker, former team captain with a lot of special teams experience as well. And I like this pick. I also watched an interview with this kid. I think he's got a lot of good energy, and he's going to get to be in a room with a lot of accomplished linebackers, something we haven't really had here in Washington for the last few years. But this is a guy. Look, think about it. You get to come in, you get to learn under Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu, even Jamin Davis, to a degree, right? This kid is going to be set up for success, and I could even see them, potentially, we'll kind of see how the season goes. But in the event, just thinking ahead, they move on from Jamin Davis after this season or opt not to pick up. I believe they already opted not to pick up his option. I can't. You got one of y'all correct me on that, but um, in the event they don't see a future with him, this is another guy that they're going to need to kind of develop. Bobby Wagner is no spring chicken, although still plays at a high level. This is a guy that you could see ultimately develop to be that main guy alongside Frankie Louvu in the linebacker room. So I really like the pick. What are y'all's thoughts?
Yeah, so Jamin Davis, his fifth year option was declined earlier this month.
Got it.
So this is a make or break year for him. Obviously, was drafted by the old regime. He's going to need to prove it this season, albeit now probably with the most uh the most crowded linebacker room that he has had in his time in Washington. Now with Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu, of course, gonna be slotted in to be starters, pretty much guaranteed. He could sub in as a third linebacker potentially. There's other guys gonna still be fighting for that spot, but yeah, Jordan McGee, I'm not sure that this guy, is somebody that could immediately make an impact just given the signings we just made. However, you do see the traits that, again, that you said that they're looking for. He was a two-time captain at Temple, started for 3 years, led the team in tackles for each of the past 2 seasons. I see this guy as possibly a special teams contributor this year. Um, and with that, the team captain designation that marks as a guy that's going to be willing to, do what it takes to help the team. So Jordan McGee, um, you know, going to be in contention with kind of Anthony Pittman, Michael Walker, is for the back end of our linebacker depth. Um, I would maybe expect this guy to be seeing the field in special teams and, you know, again, trying to do everything he can to make an impact for our team, hopefully.
Yeah, and this was a guy during the draft who we heard from other friends of ours who obviously were watching the draft just as intently as us that they wanted this guy in the late rounds, and we kind of stole him with this pick. His biggest knock was that he was undersized. I don't think that's that big of a knock on him. I mean, Bobby Wagner, his teammate, and now a guy who's going to be his mentor to some degree, is as comparably undersized. McGee's 6'1", 228. Wagner's listed as 6', 240. So I think that he's got a great base in terms of people to learn from. I agree with you. He's not going to be a day one starter. He's not going to be a major impact guy in the first, maybe even 2 to 3 seasons. But you will see him work in there. You'll see him take some of those John Mayo snaps that we sort of hated, but we now have a little bit of hope with those snaps, with the younger guy coming in, sort of possibly getting a better look. I mean, from everything that people say about him, he has a lot of positives, and that the biggest knock on him was his size is a great thing because you know size can be made up for in a number of ways, including skill. And I think that this is a guy who's extremely skilled. And then once again, I think that this sort of cements that this draft wasn't about necessarily picking the best player on the board, although we did that a number of times. This draft was about getting high character guys who are going to bring in sort of a culture that hasn't been damn good in years. So I think that this is a guy that is going to contribute to that sort of culture overhaul that they're attempting to do after the Snyder regime moved out. And they sort of have to make their own sort of impression on it as an ownership group. So no problem with this pick. You know, if he doesn't end up playing until his second or third year, I don't think any of us are mad about it. I think that he's a great depth piece and he's a good young guy to build around, especially if he's able to develop with the mentorship of these guys that he's going to be around. And that this sort of idea of these guys who might not be able to make a big impact sort of comes in here with the next fifth round pick, who was taken ultimately, I believe, 22 selections later, in Dominique Hampton, safety out of Washington. He's a big guy, 6'2", 215, not necessarily going to be an impact starter. He wasn't a full-time starter at Washington until the 2022 season, but sort of made an impact as he did. He kind of reminds me of Fabian Moreau a little bit. They talk about how he's big and fast and athletic, and that's something that you can work with. And that was kind of what we saw with Fabian Moreau. And we got a lot of serviceable years. A lot of people don't see him being a guy that sticks in the NFL necessarily unless a team really commits to him. I think that we certainly have the ability to develop this guy. Now, obviously, safety isn't necessarily a position of need, although that we've had a little bit of turnover here and there from that position. But we bring in Jeremy Chin and we bring in a few other guys, as well as re-signing Jeremy Reeves to kind of solidify that position. And I have no problem with taking Hampton here. I'm curious as to what you guys think about what some people might consider a questionable pick.
I think there's a lot of similarities with this pick to a Jordan McGee, obviously different position, but Hampton, this is a guy that was at Washington for 6 years. As you mentioned, only started his last two. He was named the most outstanding special teams player at Washington in 2021. So again, I think this is a guy that you see could make an impact on special teams. In a crowded safety room, especially considering the signing of Jeremy Chin. You've got Derek Forrest. You've spent draft capital on guys like Quan Martin, higher, in the draft in the fifth round. So uh, I think it is, again, like we mentioned and we've said again, a guy that spent 6 years with his team and worked his way up to get into a starting role. Again, it speaks to the character. So, with these late round picks, trying to find guys that they want to try to help establish the culture, something that has been lacking for really as long as I can remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think this pick was good. I like the player. He seems athletic, very physical, good combine numbers. Again, another former team captain and coming from a successful Washington program, right? Washington Huskies. Um, but was this really a position of need for us? I don't know. I would have liked us to maybe spend this pick on another tackle, personally. I don't hate the pick because I think we can never have too much depth in that safety room. And I'm not thrilled with the likes of Percy Butler or, we really don't know what Derek Forrest we're going to get, right, coming off of an injury. Um, and, really, but beyond that, just having obviously Jeremy Chin and Jeremy Reeves, our Jeremy's back there. So I get it. Do I think they were maybe would I have spent this pick capital elsewhere? Maybe. We'll just have to kind of wait and see how productive he can be.
And speaking of productivity, that kind of lends well into this final pick of the draft for us. Obviously, we take a guy in with sort of an interesting name, Javante Jean-Baptiste. Now, obviously, the easy comp would be Ricky Jean-Francois, if not just for both of them having a hyphenated last name. Jean-Baptiste is a relatively big guy, 6'5", but he is extremely undersized for a modern NFL defensive end at 239 pounds. Um, we have a friend of ours who's a Notre Dame fan, and he said, the best thing about this guy is that he doesn't remember the name because that means that he didn't mess up. And whether that's a glowing, review or not, which obviously some people would say it's not, I think that it's not the worst thing in the world. And it fills, a hole, not a hole per se, but it fills at least a gap in our team where we have a little bit more defensive end depth, especially considering the amount of guys that we're going to be expecting to rotate in there. This is a guy who started at Ohio State, so he was obviously a very, well-liked recruit. Um, and he played very well at Notre Dame during the final uh, years there. But he's sort of seen as a developmental guy, and he definitely needs to put on some weight. Obviously, seventh round picks, you're counting pennies at that point. But it's important for us to talk about these guys because these could be the guys that make the difference. I mean, Brock Purdy, you're going to hear it for the next 20 years in the draft, but Brock Purdy, taken with the very last pick, led that 49ers team on the run this past year that it seemed so magical. And this seventh round pick can really make a difference. Not sure if we necessarily got a difference maker here, but it'll be interesting to see how he develops. I'm just curious if you guys have any sort of thoughts on this. Obviously, it's a changing defensive line room, so we need to be aware of that. But your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, again here, I think this is a pick where I would have been a little bit more comfortable taking another tackle piece to add to that room. I think edge is somewhat of a need, but not necessarily one that we'd want to take a seventh rounder on to help with that need, if that makes sense. I don't hate the player. I mean, he looks a little undersized, but he's fast. If he could bulk up, maybe he could turn into something for us. I personally think this is the only player that we drafted that will not be on the 53. I think this is more likely a practice squad type candidate. Um, but he could very much so surprise us. So who knows? He's going to be battling it out really if he is trying to get onto this 53 with maybe one or two spots that are amongst a lot of guys that I can think of, kind of maybe on that kind of back end of the edge rusher side of the house. So again, don't know if we'll see too much of him this year. But not hating the player. I don't hate the pick. I could have used it on another positional group and been okay with that as well, though. And all that said, how do we feel about this draft as a whole? We just kind of went through all of our picks there in a little bit of detail. What grade would you give this draft? I mean, I'd love to hear your guys' responses. I think if I was to give it one based on what we know today and what our needs are, I'd give it a B. Um, I feel this draft class has a lot of value volatility. And that might be a phrase I'm making up, but value volatility, as I think a lot of these players will be forced into seeing playing time, and how they fare will ultimately dictate how successful we feel this draft was. So I'm going to give it a B for now at the face value. I think that looking back, mid-season, end of the season, if we were to grade the class again, it could that could go up or down. Obviously, hope it goes up, but I'm saying a solid B. What are y'all's thoughts?
I'm gonna go ahead and be a big J journalist and give my draft grade of an A. Um, I think that there was a clear-cut need for us to, select our hopeful franchise quarterback. And in doing so, if you have the opportunity to do that, any draft that you do has to be considered a success. So I would like to think, and I'm not the biggest fan of draft grades as it is because it's so hard to determine right after the fact. Really after a season or a few is when that happens. But in the age of clicks and impressions and talking points on talk shows, you got to have the fast grade reactions. But I was really happy with our first 2 days. I like all of the players that we drafted in those first 3 rounds. And because of that, because of the fact of the volume of picks that we had in those first 2 days, that's why I'm comfortable giving this an A.
Yeah, and I don't mean to price is right, you guys here. I'm gonna say B plus. I lean a little bit more towards Chris when I think about this draft. I think that there's probably at least two guys who aren't going to make the team. I think Dominique Hampton and Javante Jean-Baptiste are definitely going to be very fringe guys. If they make it, they're probably going to be on the practice squad. Outside of those two, the only real question mark for me is Luke McCaffrey and what that's going to turn into. Obviously, as you mentioned, Clark, social media has gotten a little bit crazy with posting him. You forget this guy is a third round pick and a 2-year wide receiver in college, and this was a wide receiver class that had a lot of depth to it. I certainly don't disagree with the pick. I think that there's a lot of potential there. And Clark, you make a great point. Anytime you have a chance to draft your franchise quarterback, it's an A draft. But I'm not sold on Jaden, but I'm feeling better about him as we've moved along. As for the other picks, I feel like every pick in this draft, outside of the two that I mentioned that will be cut, are going to be value adds, at least net positives. And if nothing else, the one thing that we really positively came out of this draft with is a vision for the future. These guys want leaders. They want guys who are going to be high character. They want guys who are going to contribute to a winning culture. And I think that we picked guys in the right spots to do that. And we certainly got lucky with some of the oddity of this draft. Um, but that's not to say that this draft didn't work out for us in every sense of the word. I think we got better at almost every position, and I think that we made a lot of positive moves here. I just think that there are those those two guys that are probably not going to be on this team by the end of training camp might be a practice squad player. We might even see them come back midway through the season with injuries. Um, yeah, I'm willing to commit myself to saying that this was a B plus draft. I certainly think that we grew from it. I think we got positives from it. And at the end of the day, you're right, Clark. These guys have to be on the field for 2 to 3 years for us to know. But in terms of a fan's perspective right now, and that's all that I am as a fan, it seems to be a pretty positive draft. So that's where I'll lean on that. And then obviously there's a few more rookies that we do have to talk about, as the Commanders did go on and sign some undrafted free agents. A few names in here that you may or may not know, depending on whether you've been following college football as intently as some other people. But maybe the biggest one, and I think the one that we do need to talk about because it may have already cost a guy his job, is Sam Hartman, quarterback out of Notre Dame. Obviously, a guy who was sort of beloved in Notre Dame, maybe not for his play more than his looks. I mean, the guy, if there was a football Jesus Christ, this guy would probably be the closest thing to it in terms of looks. Um, and you see Jake Fromm obviously cut from the team following our signing of him. So it's interesting to see him added to this, as well as a number of other UDFAs. But what are your guys' thoughts on Sam Hartman? Seems like a guy who this organization might trust early on to at least, stay with the team for a year.
Yeah, Sam Hartman, another quarterback that we're bringing in that has a lot of college experience. He was a longtime starter at Wake Forest before taking that last transfer year to go to Notre Dame. You know, had some moments here and there, wasn't necessarily, a star quarterback, but he's a guy with a lot of experience. And as you mentioned, they cut Jake Fromm, shortly after we brought this guy in. It's looking like he's going to be competing with Jeff Driscoll probably for that third quarterback spot on this team. And again, I think this is similar to what I said about Luke McCaffrey. This is another guy that is going to be bringing in a lot of media attention, despite the fact of the caliber of player he actually might be, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for a Commanders team that often is overlooked by the media and nobody really cares enough to talk about. Um, but Sam Hartman, again, I alluded to this earlier in the show. When we got RG3, we also had another rookie quarterback that was on the roster. It's very possible that this guy could uh, have the ability to beat out a Jeff Driscoll. I feel like when I watched him, that's kind of what I thought. I thought, this guy's not a bad quarterback. He makes some throws, but by no means is this guy, have the ceiling of a starter. But I from what I've seen, I think that this guy could potentially, develop, be able to be a, maybe not develop, but has enough experience and has seen so much football that, you could be comfortable with him, potentially playing in a backup role throughout his career.
Yeah, I won't beat a dead horse on this. But yeah, I mean, I think it's clear the staff didn't want anything to do with Fromm, so he's long gone. And I think that Sam Hartman probably has a little bit more upside, just given that he's, although an older rookie, still a rookie at that, and a guy that they're probably hoping to kind of mold and develop, um, alongside Jaden, not as the starter, but as, like you say, Clark, potentially a long-term backup option for them. So who knows? We'll see. Um, I don't. I think it's good that they brought another young QB into the mix, regardless of really who it was. I didn't think they were going to take another one in the draft like they did in 2012, right? Um, there's a little bit less of that kind of pressure dynamic than there was with RG3 and then Kirk being taken in the fourth. So kind of close, really, in the grand scheme of things, right? Sam Hartman being undrafted, he really poses no threat to Jaden Daniels. And I don't think that anyone in the building thinks that either. But obviously, could be locking up that QB3 spot away from Driscoll if he has a strong camp.
Yeah, and there's one last interesting note to make about Sam Hartman. Obviously, some of the Commanders fans around the league are calling him Slinging Sammy 3.0. There's a lot of hype around him amongst fans, but one of the things that I do think you do have to note, especially about his college career, is that this is a guy who outplayed Caleb Williams in the Notre Dame versus USC game, a guy who was the #1 overall pick. So whether you put any stock into college stats or not, that's at least something to note about him, is that he has seemed to step up in some bigger games. And there's a lot of belief that this guy could be a guy that could stick on this roster, and I'm in no position to say that he can't, especially considering his biggest competition is Jeff Driscoll, which, no offense to the guy personally, but Jeff Driscoll, just, he hasn't really been a consistent NFL quarterback for most of his career. So, I was sort of hoping for, maybe like a Jake Luton to really, get this guy used to the NFL experience, maybe understand the ropes a little bit better. But him versus Sam Hartman versus Driscoll will certainly be something to watch throughout the preseason, if not for, the next week or two of OTAs.
That is an outstanding call out. Jake Luton, also sometimes referred to as Jake Ludden in our inner circles. Um, y- Absolutely fantastic call out there, Tom. Nonetheless, um, a couple other guys that I might want to talk about. First one I'm going to bring up is Georgia wide receiver Marcus Rosemy Jack Saint, who was brought in as a UDFA. And, I'll say it, guys. There's been a void in this wide receiver room ever since a certain SEC big wide receiver left. Of course, referring to our beloved Cam Sims. Now, Rosemy Jackson, that's clearly big shoes to fill, but this guy, he's a bigger receiver. He seems to have strong hands, not necessarily killer speed, but I watched a little bit of tape and he has the ability to make some impressive catches, contested catches, jumping, in the back of the end zone. And, being a bigger guy, maybe not killer speed, coming from a school like Georgia, in the SEC. Guys, the Cam Sims comparisons are strong with this one.
Absolutely. And the one you do make a good point about the weakness of speed. I think that is one thing that him and Cam Sims really shared. Cam Sims, while he was able to make amazing plays on the field, didn't necessarily separate too well. But he was able to contribute to the team nonetheless. And Rosemy Jackson is definitely a guy who's very interesting. He came in, sort of not necessarily thought to be a guy that was going to be picked, especially considering he didn't necessarily have the best ball skills. Sort of improved during his time there. But you're absolutely right. The comparison that jumps off the page is Cam Sims. He's a big physical guy. He had over 1,000 receiving yards last year, which is almost insane that he didn't get drafted with the sort of stats that he put up. But it is those sort of raw physical attributes and maybe the lack of some of those physical attributes that you might look for in the NFL that I think caused him to drop this low. And I absolutely agree. He will probably be one of the few UDFAs who continue to make this roster following cuts.
Yeah, I think it's a good comparison really to Cam Sims. I would love if we could get another guy like him in the building. I don't think that this guy makes the 53. I think he's really vying for a practice squad spot at this point, and I would be perfectly comfortable with him on that. Um, the speed thing was a little concerning, I think, but hey, and that's not all there is. I know I've seen clips and footage of him making some pretty spectacular catches even thus far in the rookie mini camp. So I think it's I'm happy to have a guy like that, maybe a guy that's not as much like the other guys in that wide receiver room. I think it's good to have a kind of diverse group, so to speak. So I'm about it.
And there was one group that I was really interested in that I saw that we signed two players from, which is the running back position. Obviously, we signed Austin Jones from USC, a guy who Didn't necessarily have the speed that we expected to see him have at the combine, sort of ran in the 4.5 territory. And then we also pick up a guy in Marcus Wiley who's very interesting. Sort of the thing about Wiley that's very interesting is that he went to U of A and was a running back there. And the one thing that you have to know about U of A is that they've had a really bad football program for multiple years before this, and they kind of went into this dark period where they were even allowing walk-ons from students on campus to sort of make the team, and they needed this depth. And he ended up being a big contributor for a U of A team that sort of turned around their fortunes here in the past 2 years. He made a big impact on their offense. He rushed for over 1,000 yards. He seemed to be a great back. Both of these guys coming out with not the most impressive numbers at the combine, but certainly making an impact on the field. Also, one more important thing to note is that Austin actually was the running back who took over for Najee Harris at Antioch in California after Najee Harris went to Alabama. So certainly a little bit of pedigree in that room, but not necessarily guys who I expect to make the team per se, especially given the depth of our running back room. But who's to say that one of these guys doesn't make it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Mike Wiley, Tom. I like this kid. I think he's quick. He's a solid runner and can also catch and block. So he's really well rounded. I think, well, firstly, I think that this team, being the Washington Commanders, is the most attractive landing spot for an undrafted free agent in the entire NFL, given that they're turning this roster over. It gives you much of a better opportunity to be looked at and to maybe crack a roster spot or even a practice squad spot. Whereas in another situation or another camp of another team where they're not doing such a big roster overhaul, it's much harder to latch on. So that said, I think Mike Wiley, actually, out of any of the undrafted free agents that we have, has the best shot and best path to making the actual 53 roster. And I say that because I think he threatens C-Rod. I think he threatens Chris Rodriguez's spot as that third back that we have. I think he's a more dynamic running back than C-Rod. He's a guy that this staff obviously liked enough to want to bring in, and the staff has no affiliation to C-Rod other than the fact that he's here when they took over the organization. He was a 6th-round pick made by the previous regime. So I think that Mike Wiley, you could very well see him getting playing time, and he could very well be the one of the UDFAs that we actually see making the roster. I feel like we tend to have a UDFA make the 53 each year. It seems like I'm kind of blanking on who that might have been for last year, but I know like in previous
Mitchell
years, like
Tinsley.
Mitchell Tinsley. There you go. Thank you, Clark. Mitchell Tinsley last year before was Armani Rogers, and so forth. We tend to see a guy sneak in from the UDFAs each year, and um, that's something that we got to watch out for. So I would love to kind of see more of him, and I'm really interested.
Yeah, I can't say I've heard a ton. The one thing I would counter that with is that there is a guy that has familiarity with the staff because Austin Jones, as Tom mentioned, running back from USC, he would have been working alongside Cliff Kingsbury this past season, who was an offensive specialist, on that staff. So just something to mention. These guys spent 2 years at USC, rushed for 705, 5 touchdowns and 22. Last year, 477 and 7 touchdowns. Not eye-popping stats by any means. But just the fact that he has that level of familiarity with Kingsbury and, maybe has some familiarity with some of his, uh, what he likes to do in the running game could lend him, a slightly an upper hand in that situation. But, you know, probably find out more this offseason and in the preseason.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that we do have to note here, especially with the running back position, and considering that Cliff Kingsbury is coming in, is that this will probably be a bit more of a pass heavy offense. I mean, obviously, you can't get much more pass heavy than last year, where you have guys like Sam Howell taking 50 attempts in a game, as a guy who hadn't really had much of an opportunity. I do hope we lean on the running game a bit more, but sadly, I don't see that being a reality. I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, this is again going to be a high passing team, as we've seen the NFL sort of transition more towards a passing game. Although I would like to note that the NFL's best teams seem to have a very effective running back running the ball. And unless you're Patrick Mahomes, you're going to need a guy to run the ball to be a contender in this league. So that's the one note that I would make, is that I'm not necessarily sure how many running backs we're really going to keep rostered, especially with the number of additions and the guys that we sort of offloaded being relatively low. There's going to be a lot of guys cut from this team, and I sadly think that these are two names which are very likely. Although Chris does make a good point, I think Chris Rodriguez is a guy that has to watch his back with Wiley and Jones coming in. But with that, I'd like to focus on one last free agent, that UDFA, that I thought would make a big impact, which is the big tight end out of UCLA, excuse me. Colson Yankoff seems, according to Chris, to possibly be more of an H back, a fullback type guy in the NFL, but might be a contributor for this roster and might even take some snaps away from Sinat at the fullback position if that's where they're looking towards putting Sinat on the field. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on these guys. I know Chris will certainly have something to say about this guy.
Yeah, I do like this guy, and I think he could even be, I know I just said Mike Wiley might have a shot at 53. I think Yankoff has a less good of a shot, but a shot, albeit nonetheless. I think he could even tie up that fourth tight end spot, right? If we elect to keep that many. And also considering if the staff doesn't like Cole Turner and Armani Rogers, right? I think you could see a guy like Yankoff sneak into the roster, and I definitely think he's a guy you'll see on that practice squad if we're able to even keep him on there from other teams poaching. This guy has literally played every offensive position other than O-line in college. He came into college as a QB, transferred around positions. He's played receiver, he's played running back, he's played tight end, he's played fullback. He's basically a Taysom Hill, really your Swiss Army knife type of player. Very intriguing. Again, probably not a path to the 53, although it's possible, but definitely a good practice squad stash. And again, I could see him being that fourth TE or fourth running back they keep if they opted to kind of do that at either of those positional groups. So again, definitely a guy to look out for and a fun one to watch.
Well, that will do it for our draft and undrafted free agency recap. Certainly a lot to talk about, a lot of new players coming into the fold, and a lot of intrigue on both sides of the ball, as a result of these additions that we have made. This won't be the last you hear of us before the start of next season. We'll be back at it this summer, as news surrounding the team progresses, as we get deeper into camp and the preseason. And of course, the NFL schedule is out now as well. So we will be coming to you with our full season prediction this summer. So remember to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date and know when we are dropping our new content. So for my co-hosts, Tom and Chris, my name is Clark. You have been listening to the Going Commando podcast. And as always, HTTR and HTTC.